Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Dr. Ryan Cragun. He's the co-author of Goodbye Religion, along with Jesse Smith, and we're going to be talking more about this book. Why is it that some people leave religion and other people, like me, stay? We'll find out more from Ryan in our next conversation. You won't want to miss it. Check it out. Because, I have to say, I grew up in a pretty Orthodox home. Mm-hmm. I can remember as a teenager people being like, be careful about church history. You might lose your testimony.
Right.
And so I always knew that there was something out there that was a little bit forbidden. And, I had to be careful. And and so I kind of knew something was out there. I didn't know what it was.
Right. Sure.
I will say when I came across polyandry especially, it made me sick to my stomach.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh my gosh.
This was a thing. Yeah.
But I got through it, The racism is another thing. I just had an interview with Brant Gardner about White and Delight. So I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe the angry responses that I got.
Sure.
Usually from ex-Mormons, mostly from ex-Mormons that were just like, you're defending racism. I'm like, I didn't say anything. Brant said whatever he said.
Right.
He can stand behind it. I'm, as a podcaster,
just giving it
whether
voice.
Whether I agree with Ryan Cragun or Brant Gardner or the polygamist Josh Thompson or whoever, I am always going to defend my guest no matter what, because I appreciate you coming on here. And if I don't defend you, why would you come back? Come on.
I can defend myself.
Exactly.
I'm a professor. I'm good. Yeah.
But I just get these angry people and because they are betrayed.
Yeah.
And you did say that you went through that for a time, because you don't strike me as somebody
who's angry now.
You're not angry now.
No.
And some people, it feels like it takes decades to get over this anger, and some people do it in 6 months, and some people never go through it. I got another message from somebody that said, well, I know you're a member of the ex-Mormon community. I'm like, what are you saying? Where did you get that? Because I'm friendly with ex-Mormons, therefore I'm part of it. So I'm kind of part of all these. But can you talk a little bit about that betrayal process and how it relates in your book?
Yeah. So I'll start with mine, and then we can go back to the book, because many people, particularly our interviewees, we have 120 interviewees that we include in the book. Most of them did leave, and some of them, they make Orthodox Mormonism look pretty tame. Some of the stuff that some of these guys went through, that genuinely, it's just really disturbing. But so for me, I did grow up Morgan, Utah, very devout. My dad eventually was a bishop. My grandfather had been a stake president, right? So it was very devout, the pioneer heritage, no polygamy. No polygamy on that side, right? We weren't one of the 20%, but yeah, it's very, very devout family. My parents met at BYU, right? Mm-hmm. So that gives you a flavor for that. And I really had been raised in this sense.
There are a lot of Craguns from North Ogden. I know you grew up in Morgan, but there are a ton.
Yeah, so Cragun settled North Ogden,
okay,
right? And
I know lots of Craguns from North Ogden.
Yeah. Just to give you a flavor, my paternal grandfather and his brother married 2 sisters.
Oh, okay.
And then 2 of their brothers married 2 of his sisters. Talk about complicated lineages, and it gets really messy. But my dad's one of 7. He had 9 kids, right? And just in the cousins, I have 50 cousins. Wow. It's insane. And that's just one branch of the Cragun family. So tons of Craguns out there. But yeah, I grew up in a very Orthodox, very devout family. We had, scripture reading every morning before we went to school. Seminary was just a given. We were required to go to church. And so I was taught a very specific way. It wasn't until, and I was the Peter priesthood growing up, right? I was
super Orthodox.
I was super Orthodox, right? Very, very devout. Super, super devout in every aspect that matters. And then I went on my mission.
Where'd you go?
Costa Rica.
Okay.
Costa Rica, 96 to 98. And I still remember, I'm a voracious reader, right? I love to read. So in the MTC, they had missionary guide of like the books that you could read. And there's like 5 books. It's like Talmage's Jesus the Christ, right? It was like 5 books. I read them all in the first month in the MTC.
Oh, you're kidding me.
Yeah, it's like I like to read, right?
I hated to read until I got into Mormon history.
Oh, and then it gets exciting. Yeah.
Sports. I can read sports.
You can read sports. I just like, I'm going to read. Like, put something in front of me. I'm going to read it. I'm just going to read it. So I'd already read the Book of Mormon cover to cover multiple times, all of Doctrine and Covenants. I hadn't read all of the Bible, but that's what I turned to after I did that. I was like, all right, I guess I'll just read the whole Bible. Read the whole Bible, cover to cover.
In
right?
the MTC?
In the MTC.
Oh my gosh. That took me a year just to get through the Old Testament.
I read fast. I was just moving. And then I was like, what do I read? Right. And so I started asking, like, genuinely, like, what do I read now? Like, I've read all the things. So like, well, read them again.
Yeah.
No. Like, seriously? Like, what else am I going to learn if I just keep reading the same book over and over again? So pretty quickly, when I got to my mission
You didn't
field,
go into fundamentalism?
No, luckily I did not. I have a bunch of fun stories about this.
Truth
from my
Magazine?
mission. Yeah, nope. Stayed away from all of that. There was like a 3-ring binder of like, it's not really apocryphal stuff, right? But it was like stuff that was getting passed around from missionary to missionary that was like a little deeper, right? And I pretty quickly got a copy of that. And then I got a copy of King Follett Discourses, right?
Nice.
So I was getting a few things that I was like, oh, this is a little interesting, right? So I started reading stuff that was not in the approved reading
Uncorrelated.
list. Yes, uncorrelated.
Journal of Discourses?
Eventually got there.
Oh, wow.
Right? So somebody had a copy of some of those. And
I'm
so
surprised you're not a polygamist.
I did try and somebody tried to recruit me once.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was after my mission. That was after my mission. So I just was reading all these things. And then eventually, some of the other missionaries who most people don't read like I do. And that's not a bad thing, right? Like, that's fine. You do you. I don't really care. But this is just part of my nature. So I was reading everything I could get my hands on. And then some of the other missionaries were coming to me saying like, hey, I've got a question, right? And so they would be asking me things like, specific doctrinal things or history things. And then some of the stuff that like, I was meeting with these investigators and they raised this issue and they said they got it out of an anti-Mormon book, right? That's the language. I don't like anti-Mormon as a word, but like, fine.
Right.
So then I bought a couple of them on my mission.
Anti-Mormon books?
Yes. I straight up bought them.
You and Mark Hoffman.
I know. One of them was one of the Tanner's books, right?
Oh, right.
In Spanish.
Oh, you're kidding?
Yeah. So I was able to justify a lot of these things because I'm like, I'm practicing my Spanish, right? So I'm just practicing my Spanish. So I started reading those.
Does Sandra know it's in Spanish?
I don't know.
I'll have to ask her.
Yeah, I don't know. It was interesting, right? So I was reading, I had like 3 of them, and I had to keep them really secret because there were a couple of companions who were like, that's not allowed. And I was like, I'm reading them so I can help other missionaries, right? Which is genuinely what I was doing. So I was reading them, and I was like, oh, I don't think that's right. Let me dig into this deeper. And so this is pre-internet days. It's not like I had the internet to look stuff up. This is 1997, basically, which I guess the internet existed, but not in Costa Rica where I was. So I was reading a bunch of this stuff. Again, I wouldn't even say at that point that my testimony was challenged. I was fine, right? I was reading it because I was trying to help people. Halfway through my mission, we got a new mission president. I actually was in the office as the financial secretary, in part because I think the previous mission president wanted to keep his eyes on me because I started asking questions. One of my favorite questions that I asked him that like you could see his eyes light up. I was like, was Joseph Smith a Freemason? And he's like, where did you hear that? And I was like, is that a problem to ask that? That seems like a fair question, right? Like, that's a fair question, isn't it? Within a month, I was called into the mission office as the financial secretary. And I served there for, 6 months or something.
Yeah.
So I was there during the transition to a new president who was actually from Columbia. The previous one was from Rexburg, Idaho, right? Steeped in the tradition. Come on, like this guy had a long history. The other one was a convert, right? And he was getting a lot of these questions. So he actually, I think he just asked among the missionaries. I was like, well, who do I talk to? Because I'm getting asked these questions and I don't know the answers. They sent him to me. I wrote him like a 40-page report where I went through and rebutted all of these anti-Mormon arguments.
Kidding me.
No, like I was the guy, right? So I was familiar with all of this stuff.
Right.
Now, I do know because I was a good Mormon. I had a diary. I had a journal, right? So I was keeping a lot of thoughts in there. And there's like 1 or 2 instances where you can see I had a shelf, right? I remember the line really clearly that it was like, either Mormonism is the greatest thing that has ever happened to the planet, or it is a huge lie. And at some point, I've got to figure that out. Throw it on the shelf. I'm going to go back and do my missionary.
This was a quote, or what?
That was me. That was just me. I just
you.
wrote that as like a line in my journal. Was like, either it is the greatest thing that has ever happened, or it's a huge lie.
Wow.
And I've got to figure this out, but I don't have time right now, and I don't have the resources. Right, I'm in the middle of nowhere in Costa Rica. Eventually, so a lot of this plays out, right? In the mission home. So I was in the mission office, which was like 6 blocks away from the mission home, and they'd invite us over for lunch or dinner like once a week.
Mm-hmm.
There was an amazing library on the 2nd story in the mission home. So every time they'd invite us over, I'd take my backpack, I'd excuse myself to go to the bathroom, and I would sneak up to the library. And I would just take as many books as I could fit in my backpack, slide them in my backpack, and head over, right? And I would just devour them during the week because everybody's doing their gospel study in the morning. They're reading some scripture because I've never read them before. And I've read them all. I'd read the Book of Mormon like 8 times before my mission, right? So I'd read everything. I was like, I'm not going to read it anymore. So I'm just devouring these books, and then I'd go back and swap them out every week. So I read tons of stuff.
No way. That's awesome.
I was just really, really busy reading a lot of things. And that's actually what made me switch my major. Pre-mission, I was pre-med at the University of Utah. I was going to be a physician.
Okay.
Post-mission, I was like, no, it's time. I've got to figure this religion thing out. Right. So this is a very long story.
You didn't go into religious studies, though.
I didn't. I took a couple of, I'm trying to think if they even had religious studies at the University of Utah. They had some anthropology classes. Those were really helpful in kind of working through this. But the class is the craziest thing. The class that finally helped me see like, oh, this is where I belong. It was a communication class, but we read Berger and Luckman's The Social Construction of Reality. And they use a couple of examples of religion in there. But that book, which is really hard to read, there are a couple of German scholars who moved to the U.S., so the translation, I mean, it's good enough, but they just write really densely, so it's hard to read. But that was when I was like, oh my gosh, these guys get it. Religion is a social construct. And it was super eye-opening. And then I read another book. It was like a sociology textbook that talked about religion as a social construct, and it was like showing statistics and stuff. I was like, all right, this is my path. This is where I have to go to figure this out. So I was trying to understand the psychology of religion, which was fine. That's important. And I do some of that still, right? Most of my work's really sociology, but I was doing some of that. Then I found sociology. I never even did like a whole bunch of stuff on history, and certainly theology is not really my thing. But it was that path that really led me down there. Went to grad school. After a year of grad school, you could start teaching during the summer in my graduate program once you had a master's degree, really. So that first summer, I kind of had like 3 months where I didn't have anything to do. Now, I should have been working on like grad school stuff, right? But I was like, it's time. So I just started cracking open like Thomas O'Day's The Mormons, right? Which is a sociological book about the Mormons written by a non-Mormon, right? It's a great book if you haven't read it. It was written in like 1930s or something like that.
Oh, you're kidding. It's old.
It's really good. It's a great book, right? But he came and like studied Mormons in southern Utah and wrote this really good book about it. And so I read that, and then I read some Armin Moss work, and then I started going a little deeper into some of the historical stuff. And then I was like, this doesn't work, right? This isn't true for me. It's not going to work for me. And that's when I made my break and decided I was going to leave.
So was it history?
It was the history. It was the doctrine. It was some of the scientific claims.
What made you most uncomfortable?
Probably the Book of Mormon.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was probably claims about like horses and steel swords. You've heard all of these things,
I know.
right? Yeah,
I'm
you've
just
heard
curious. Yeah.
I think it was those anachronisms that just didn't make any sense to me that finally pushed me to, it was like, oh.
It's a fiction book instead of a historical book.
And I had been taught my whole, this is, I think, what we're getting at when we talk about like that fundamentalist understanding of Mormonism, where the Book of Mormon is true history, right? Mm-hmm. If you believe that, and then you start learning like, wait, there were no elephants here, right? There were no horses here. There were no steel swords here. Like,
you didn't check out the Melee theory of the book.
Right, exactly. Right. So if you switch the location to try and fit it, right? I had been taught my whole life, this is a history of the Native Americans here in the United States, right? In all of America, right? So it was those kinds of things that once I cracked through that and was like, oh, no, that's just not, like, that's not true, right? Like, there's no way this can be true. And then once I realized, and that sense of betrayal that I brought up, it's when I realized that and I was like, wait.
I've been fooled my whole life.
Yes, they've known this forever, right? Like, we've known this for a very long time that these things were just not true. Why didn't anybody tell me? And then you get down this, it's a bit of a rabbit hole of like, the leaders have to know this. Why aren't they telling everybody this, right? My bishop probably knew this. My grandfather was a stake president.
Do you think your bishop really knew this?
Not all of them. Not all of them.
Yeah, I don't either. But because you hear that.
Yeah.
I mean, I can understand people who go after the apostles, but the local leaders,
I don't think most of them know.
Pay attention to this. No. They don't know, don't care.
Some of them end up having to wrestle with it because they get these questions as they're meeting with people, but I think the vast majority don't, right? But this is the kind of thinking, and I'm not trying to be mean to people, right? But it's that kind of thinking of like, wait, these people have to know. They're highly educated people. Like maybe they have, maybe it's a physician. I actually had a physician as one of my Sunday school teachers, and I used to ask him some of my deeper questions, right? And he didn't know the answers to these things. But again, his area of expertise is not what I do, right? He's a physician. So why would we expect him to know these things? But you just kind of associate like educated with knowledgeable. Knowledgeable about medicine, but not knowledgeable about like church history and doctrine and teachings. So I was unfair. I think it was a bit unfair to be like, well, they all knew this. No, they probably didn't. But some people did. And why wasn't I exposed to this? In one of my first books that I wrote, I tell people this all the time. I found a statistic. It was using a big nationally representative data set. 60% of people never have questioned their religion.
That doesn't surprise me.
Right? And a lot of people are like, wait, really? And I'm like, yeah, 60% of people just never question it. Well, how, like, for me now, recognizing when we're talking about this betrayal sense, like, no one was trying to betray me, right? They were just living their lives, not realizing that I was one of those weird ones who was the whole time like, wait, hold on, I got a question about that. I got a question about everything, right? I've got lots of questions. I'm just a naturally inquisitive person. I'll ask questions about everything. Most of the people I'm around are not doing that. They're not doing it maliciously. They're just living their lives, right? In a sense, they're kind of the enlightened ones who are just living in the moment. I'm the weird one who's like the reflective life, right? Like I'm asking all the questions, and that can be anxiety producing. And then eventually, once I realize it, I'm like, I was betrayed. They knew this. Well, sure. But did anybody in my orbit actually know those things? Probably not. Right. So was I really betrayed? No, but it was that sense of like, this knowledge was available and nobody gave it to me. Why didn't I get this when I was 10 years old, right? No one was going to give it to me. I get that now. But initially, when I was going through this, that was a really hard thing to think through.
I appreciate that.
Does that make sense?
So it's like
great. Walking my way through that. So it was really hard.
I mean, to me, that's the biggest question is why does somebody like me get all this information and I'm going to stay?
Yep.
I understand people like you that choose to leave. But how am I different from you? Like, that's what I want to know. Because people all the time say to me, Rick, you know all this stuff. Why do you stay?
Yeah. No, and that's fine.
It works for me.
Yeah, it works for you. And I think that's actually, like, that's how I will usually frame it now is, when people say, like, oh, are you religious? I'm like, no, I'm from Utah. Like, oh, were you Mormon? And I was like, yes. Why'd you leave? It didn't work for me. That's usually my answer. Now, we can get into a lot of details, and you can see, like, the anger's gone. I like
that answer,
right?
Because I just had a conversation with somebody, and she was like, the church is racist, and it's a cult. And I'm like, do you know? And I quoted Matt. I actually sent her my Matt Bowman interview where we talk about why cult is a racist term.
Yeah, that's a problem. It's a real problem. Yeah.
And she didn't care.
No,
it was just like, it was too long of an explanation. You can't break this down for me simply.
Sure.
And the church is a cult and, use the bite model. And I'm like, no, I just gave you a PhD definition right here. And you don't care. Anyway, it just drove me crazy. Because there are these people, we're really not getting...
We'll get to the book eventually. I don't know how much time you have.
It might be a 4-hour conversation.
It's okay.
But there are people, we talk about Fowler stages of faith, and you talk about stage 3, stage 4, and I don't know them super well, but it's like most church members, hopefully you know this, are they stage 3? Are you familiar with Fowler?
I am. I haven't looked at it in a long time. I'm not a huge fan. It doesn't really matter. But it's certainly not the highest level of
correct. It goes up to 5 or 6, yeah.
So, they're kind of stuck at a lower level.
They're kind of, and so...
It's not a very reflective faith.
There are certain people, and I would put this woman in this category, they're stage 3 Mormons. The church is true. Don't read that anti-Mormon BS.
Right.
Keep your testimony. And then all of a sudden they do some searching. They find some racism. They find some polygamy. They find some homophobia.
It's all there.
Whatever,
Yep.
sexism. And then they turn stage 3 anti.
Right.
And proselytize. They're like, how can you believe this BS? This sexism, racism, polygamy. How can you support a prophet? And I get so tired of these people.
Well, yeah, and I get it because
But
at the end of the day,
stage 3 from one,
yes,
from pro to anti.
Right.
I mean, that's the difference.
And I don't know you well enough to actually say this, but like at the end of the day, I would say Rick probably doesn't believe all of the sexist, racist, homophobic things. Right?
Yeah,
Your belief,
I'll agree with that.
Your belief is probably nuanced enough that you know it exists, but you don't have to accept every aspect of your religion.
Thank you. Well said.
And that's hard for some people.
Oh,
right?
I know it is.
And
it's
that's
all
okay.
true or it's all false.
Yes.
So therefore, it's all false.
Right. Now, at some level, and I'm not trying to be super mean here, the LDS Church gets some blame for that. Because they are an exclusive religion that says we're true. Right.
I'm pretty sure President Hinckley said something very similar to what you wrote in your journal.
Exactly, right? That it's either the greatest thing ever or it's a huge lie. And I think it probably was cribbing from him. But, the LDS Church is an exclusive religion that says we are the one true church. Every other church may have some truth, but they don't have what we have, right? So if you teach people that, and then they eventually go, wait, that's not true, right? All you've done is set yourself up to be a disappointment for people. And when they do find the one thing or the handful of things that are pushing them out, there is that sense of well, then it's clearly just a big lie, right? Because they set themselves up for it. If they had said we're a bunch of men and some women who have lower positions, awkward, but doing the best we can, right? And we're trying to help people. I mean, it's not going to be that compelling, so they really can't do this. And we could talk about that more. But if they owned that there are warts and they owned that not everything they think is you can be a devout member of the church and not believe all of it. Can you imagine?
What?
Can you imagine one of the apostles saying that, right? That it's you know what? You don't have to believe everything.
He would
still
be dropped soon.
Exactly. So they've set themselves up for it, right? Whereas a lot of the people that I talk to, a lot of the people who go to SSR and the MSSA, they are still members of the church. Every one of them is way more nuanced, right? That there's we did this with, I hate to throw him under the bus, but Rick Phillips, who you've met Rick. Richard Bushman came to one of our SSR meetings. He was our Glen Vernon speaker, and we took him out for lunch after. And Rick just hammered him with questions. It was one of my favorite lunches ever. And by the end of it, you get a very clear sense that Richard Bushman is not towing the orthodox line. He's well, I don't necessarily agree with that, right? Sounds very similar to kind of where you are, that he knows all the history. Come on, he's writing the history. He knows the history. And at the end, he's basically saying well, maybe I don't believe that. Maybe I don't believe this. But there's still parts of it that work for me, right? And I think that's probably where you are. At the end of the day, it just didn't work for me. Once I had kind of reached that realization, I was well, okay, this isn't going to work for me. I'm going to do something else, right? And it did take me 5-ish years to get over the anger, right? So the anger, it was a long period of time. It wasn't, a month. It wasn't 6 months. It was a long time of working it out. 5 years to where I was not angry. And then probably another 5 years where I was yeah, whatever. You live your life. I'll live my life. We're all good. And I say this all the time now. I don't care if people are religious or not. I care if you're an asshole or not, right? Sorry, don't mean to joke. But are you a jerk? Are you mean to people, right? That's what I care about. If you're a religious person and you're a decent human being, cool. I don't have beef with you, right? It's the one who's no, if you're not part of my religion, you should die. Okay, now we've got an issue, right? Because you're literally saying I can't exist.
Or if you're part of the religion, you should die.
Yes, right. We find a balance here, people, right? So I don't care anymore. I'm way past that. And I'm not saying I'm better because of that. I was there in the angry stage. I totally get it. And I'm not saying that you have to leave that. If that works for you, so be it. But where I am now that I'm some of my best friends are really religious individuals. Now, all of them are very nuanced in their religion, right? None of them are coming at me if you are not exactly as I am, you are a horrible person and going to hell. It's yeah, you do you, I'll do me, we're good, right? That's fine. I don't know if that's the right thing or the wrong thing, right? If we're talking about Fowler stages of faith, I don't really care about it. But like, I am where I am now, and I'm fine with it. Like, I'm very comfortable where I am. But it was a hard process to get out, right? And that is very similar to the vast majority of the stories that we tell in the book. So we did get full circle. We're back to the book, right? But most of the people we highlight in the book, as far as interviews, they went through a tough break, right? It was that working your way out of religion process. And when I say some were like crazy, crazy devout, there was one, I'm not going to remember names. Jesse would probably remember the name. So sorry, Jesse, I'm not going to do your part do justice here. But we had one guy who his dad was a fundamentalist Christian, not Mormon, but fundamentalist Christian pastor. And in one of his quotes, he's like, we were in church every day it was open, which was 7 days a week. So
he Catholic?
No. This was like some small, like his dad was the pastor. He was homeschooled. And whenever the doors were open, he was there because his dad was the pastor. And they had services 7 days a week. So he was, like it was deep.
Because I know Catholics have mass.
They will have a mass 7 days, yeah. But this one, it was just a very, very fundamentalist, like uber Christian church. It was like a small one, right? I don't think it was particularly big. The guy's gay, right?
Uh-oh.
And an atheist. And he realizes at like 12, 14, something like that. So he comes out to his dad.
Boldly.
I think it was the atheist first. Maybe it was, I don't remember which one, right? It's in the book and the quote's pretty good. And his dad literally says to him, it's a biblical quote, like, get from me, Satan, I never knew you, right? And he disowns his son and kicks him out at like 12 years old.
Wow.
Gone, right? Those are some of the people we're dealing with. And that guy, which is fascinating, right? He spends like the next 40 years of his life trying to actually be a good Christian. So he didn't immediately just go like, I'm out, right? I'm not going to be religious anymore. It was, he wasn't sure if he believed in God, but he was going to try it. Or like he was going to try and make it work. But obviously he couldn't stay in his dad's religion because they were very homophobic and like that wasn't going to happen. So he kind of passed from church to church to church, trying to make it work. Ends up in the MCC Church, Metropolitan Community Church, which is like an LGBT affirming religion. Eventually is going to become a pastor in the MCC.
Oh, that's interesting.
So he goes like this full circle, and the whole time he's trying to get his dad's approval. So he's really just like, I'm still part of this. Like, I want to be part of this. And his dad never gives him that approval, and then eventually dies, right? So I think they kind of reconcile a little bit towards the end of his life. But then his dad dies, and while he's going through this pastor training, he's like, I actually don't believe any of this, right? Like, why am I doing this? But his story is just like a heart-wrenching but horrible story of all of the abuse that he suffers through this. And then eventually just like, no, this just isn't going to work for me. And he's done, right? And then he talks about that. But we have tons of stories like that. Now, those stories are, like I said, way more interesting than I just got bored and I didn't go anymore. So that's why that's the focus, right? And it's harder to explain the ones who were really devout and then left than the ones who were like nominal and then nominal on the other side because it just doesn't matter to them, right? Those are much easier because it's just a little drift story, right? It's like, oh, well, I never was all the way in and now I'm not necessarily all the way out, but I just don't care and I'm going to live my life. The ones who have the big dramatic breaks, they're a little harder to explain. That's why we focus on them.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Ryan Cragun. He's the co-author of Goodbye Religion along with Jesse Smith. It's a fantastic book. You really should get it. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about when the U.S. will become majority non-religious. Ryan thinks it's sooner than you think.
There is the possibility that non-religion is more like an innovation, like DVDs, and we're going to see an inflection point where suddenly this just takes off. And the vast majority of people are going to be non-religious, and then we'll get to that top edge, where it curves again, and there will still be people who are religious for a long time, but they're going to be the minority.
Isn't this terrifying to church leaders?
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt, so check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.